Hello members and welcome back to the life of Mary B. And the death, of course. We're on Mrs. Moore's screws. While Mary was busy with the various dupes, thefts and scams, her husband John was earning his rather more honest living as a wheelwright. He was employed in a business of the aptly named Mr. Wright, whose workshop, as listed in Leeds Trade Directory covering the period 1790 to 1799, was located opposite the now demolished St. James's Church in New York Street near Kirkgate Market. Still Leeds, not New York, okay? In fact, it was Mr. Wright who would later testify at Mary's trial as a crucial witness of the authentication of her handwriting. But here, we're jumping a bit ahead. Let's sort of start from where we are, not go forward. John Bateman would have had a 5-minute walk from work, to where they lived and the lodgings in Wells Yard. Though there is a good chance that it may have taken longer, but only if the streets had been busier, which back then usually was like Tuesdays and Saturdays, because those days twice a week they would be what is known as a cloth market, so therefore the streets could be busier. The business had formerly been conducted on the Leeds Bridge, but the increase in manufacturers soon made the market too big to be confined to the bridge, so trading moved to the High Street, Brigate, the wide road from the river crossing originally called Bridge Gate. The cloth market, which would eventually move to the Kirkgate site in 1822, began from the bridge, running along Brigate, at this time still lined with the old timber-framed houses and the numerous shops and workshops which occupied the yards beyond, one of which, of course, belonged to the Bateman's landlord. It then followed the course of the street northward, almost to the more like the Kirkgate junction with Commercial Street. Once adorned with a statue of Queen Anne, the hall was the meeting place for the justices of the town, and was also used to administer relief to the poor and determine the paternity of illegitimate children. It was where vagabonds were flogged, outside front of the building where the pillory and the stocks were there for all to see, and in 1664, the heads of 3 of the Farnley Wood plotters, anti-monarchists, planned to overthrow the restored Charles II, Robert Atkins, John Errington, and Henry Wilson, were to compose there, where they remained for 13 years before being dislodged in a storm. Ew, that's disgusting. The area around the Moot Hall had long been subject to serious congestion, part of a block of buildings known as Middle Row. The ground floor below the courthouse was occupied by butchers' shops, and with a roadway on each side, so narrow that it was dangerous for 2 carriages to pass one another. Although the original 17th century building was replaced in 1710, it was still considered a hindrance to traffic. Brigate was a general marketplace for all the town, cattle, fish, fruit, with as much as 500 loads of apples being sold in one day. John Bateman would have been part of the daily ebb and flow of the tide of pedestrian and wheel traffic, though Mary herself would one morning contribute to the throng when, astutely timed after the arrival of the first post, she hurried to her husband's workplace, overwrought with feigned sorrow, carrying a forged letter with the news that John's father, the resident town crier of Thirsk, was near death. Mary needn't have waited long to start out her deceitful journey. The post office in nearby Boar Lane opened at 8 o'clock in the morning in the winter months, and 7 in summer for the delivery of letters. And the letter carrier begins to deliver the letters in the town about the same time. Of course, this was immaterial to Mary, as she forged letters she was delivering, and they'd never been outside of a post satchel. Arriving at Wright's workshop, clutching the forgery detailing John Bateman Sr.'s imminent death, apparently, She entreated her husband that if he wanted to see his father before it was too late, he should immediately go to Thirsk. Go be by his side. Understandably distraught, John downed tools and, borrowing a small amount of money from his understanding employer to cover travelling expenses, he started out on the near 40-mile journey to Thirsk. Whether John hired a hack and rode there or caught one of the many mail coaches which left Leeds daily, whether he begged rides along the way, there's no actual... We can't find any notes of that or how he got there. We just know that he did actually set off. Delivery wagons are mentioned in the Leeds directory, or Sweeting's wagons, setting off from the Call Lane warehouse, ran a route to Stockton via Thirsk, so that could have been a possibility. When John arrived in the town, he must have been astonished and relieved to see his father alive and well and ringing his bell, crying the news in Thirsk Town Square. "I am glad," said the bewildered son to his father, "to see you so much better." "Better?" said his perplexed father. "Nothing's ailed me." It now became clear that the dire contents of the letter, which Mary had so hurriedly borne to her husband, was a wicked lie on his wife's part. When the furious husband returned to Leeds, her motive became all too apparent. During John's engineered absence, Mary had sold every belonging and stick of furniture from their rented house, used the monies presumably to pay off the victim or victims of another of the thefts. We assume that in spite of his wife's outrageous behaviour, forgiveness was in John Bateman's nature, and that the couple were reconciled after this first incident, at least periodically, as their marriage produced 3 children, possibly even as many as 5. The article appearing in Leeds Mercury detailing Mary's arrest, which was in October 1808, noted that she was the mother of several children. The paper was a prominent local weekly with a leadership of 3,000. It cost just 6d because of the increased stamp duty, and its editor was Edward Baines. We know that the Batemans had a son called Jack, as mention was made of him at Mary's trial. Presumably this child was the same John Bateman, Jack being a traditional sort of wording for John, who was baptised on the 21st of February 1796 in St. Peter's Parish Church, where his parents had been married. The prenatal relationship noted in the baptismal register as Father John Bateman, the church in Leeds Minster today. The vicar who baptised John was Peter Haddon. The same records yield the earlier baptism of a Mary Bateman, noted as daughter of John Bateman on the 16th of February 1794. A little less than a year after Mary and John's marriage, and possibly the daughter that Mary referred to in the letter written to her husband from the condemned cell at York Castle Gaol, requesting that her wedding ring be bequeathed to a child, a traditional bequest, as the girl, named for her mother, was the eldest. Records of Mary's last days also indicate that she was allowed to have her youngest child, although the sex wasn't stipulated with her in the condemned cell until her execution. This may have been John Bateman's sort of, his way of requesting. Recorded the son of John Bateman was baptised at St. Peter's on 19th of July 1807. That's the son that's believed to have been conceived in the jail. But, that's what we're assuming, actually. The Register of St. Peter's also show records for the baptism of a Maria Bateman on the 6th of December 1801, George Bateman, baptised on the 20th of May 1804, and as both births fall neatly into the obstetric gap between the births of the eldest child, Mary, and James, born in the summer of 1807, Marie and George may well have been the elder siblings of James, who is the most likely candidate for the child sharing Mary's imprisonment. The child would still have been classed as care-dependent of a nursing mother. Young children cared for by their mothers in prison being a distressing yet actually more common practice than what you think. John Bateman, nevertheless, must have been and had serious reservations about leaving his wife to her own devices for any length of time, as in an encore to the house clearance she previously performed during John's mercy dash to his dying father's side when he was next absent visiting friends. Mary took that opportunity to sell all of her husband's clothes, as well as many other of his belongings, along with some items she had stolen from the neighbouring tailor's ship. We cannot know what exactly made Mary tick. Did she steal for, well, vicarious excitement, the risk of getting caught? Or was she merely a plain opportunist, stealing purely for profit or greed? The issues of compulsive criminal behaviours have only relatively recently been identified and classified as mental health conditions. The aspect of Mary's life is examined more closely in the last chapter. Mary felt no compulsion regarding her actions. However, it's obvious an ex-fraudulent endeavour was indeed quite shameless. On the 13th of February, 1796, a serious fire broke out in the Marshall and Benyon flax mill in Water Lane, in the industrial district of Holbeck, on the western outskirts of Leeds. During the 18th century, fires were commonplace in mills, with the processing of flax creating a highly combustible dust, and the risk exacerbated by hot machine bearing lubricated with linseed oil, as well as the additional risk posed by workers using candles. Needless to say, the catastrophe was compounded by the inadequacies of firefighting capabilities at that time. Hand-drawn manual pumps with short range were the only equipment available. The most of the 18th century, individual insurance companies maintained their own fire brigades, extinguishing fires only in those buildings insured by the company, providing fire cover. It was not until the mid-1850s that the first reliable steam-powered appliances were adopted by brigades. This particular mill fire not only resulted in crushing financial costs amounting £10,000, in the region of £6 million by today's reckoning, because it's back then, remember, only half of which was met by the insurance, but also tragically brought a cost in lives. 10 people were known to have died in that blaze. This happened when actually one of the walls apparently collapsed and trapped them there, so that's how they died. With sympathies amongst the townsfolk running high for the injured and bereaved, Mary saw an opportunity to take good on the tragedy. Without a shred of genuine contrition, she set about relief work in collecting sheets from charitable souls for the purposes of laying out the dead whose relations were too poor to meet the costs themselves. Initially playing to a good will, a Miss Maud, a lady known for her human disposition, she had been charitably moved to supply Mary with sheets to wrap the body of a child who had fallen victim in the mill fire, and whose mother was too impoverished to provide the necessary linen herself. However, the sheets acquired by Mary, along with linen begged from 3 other good-hearted benefactors, ended up pledged in the pawnbrokers' pawnshops. Their 3 hot ball signs, a reminder of an illiterate age, sprang up wherever the working class congregated. It was possible to pledge an item in exchange for instant cash, said item to be redeemed when financial times were easier. Pawnbrokers were often fencers of stolen goods, and a few of them asked searching questions. Yet the millage Mary exacted from this calamity didn't end here, as she further had the audacity to pose as a nurse from the Leeds General Infirmary, and in this guise she was successful in collecting even more linen on the pretext that it was needed to dress the wounds of those lying injured in the infirmary. Before Florence Nightingale made nursing a respectable middle-class vocation in the 1850s, nurses were often prostitutes who provided comforts to male patients that would never be able on today's NHS hospitals themselves. They wouldn't be able to get on that system now, let alone back then. They were unhygienic in Mary's day, spreading the very disease they were supposed to be dealing with. Leeds General was built in 1771, where today's Yorkshire Bank stands off City Square. Its founding doctors were all graduates of the University of Edinburgh Medical School. Of course, the reality was that Mary pawned that linen too. Whether or not John Bateman had been turning a blind eye to his wife's deceits, the time came when he could no longer live in the state of denial. In order to escape the inevitable derisions and possible legal ramifications of Mary's frauds, he decided to join the supplementary militia, to get out of Leeds, away from the disgrace caused by his wife's conduct and the stigma that must now have been attached to the name of Bateman in many quarters. The militia were a vital part of homeland defence in the late 18th and early 19th centuries, aimed at creating a professional national military reserve and embodied at various times during the French and Napoleonic Wars, 1790–1815. They served at several strategic locations, particularly stationed on the south coast and in Ireland. Both these areas were highly vulnerable. In the 1790s and again in 1804, the French had active plans in place to invade the coast of Sussex and Kent. Ireland had for centuries been a hotbed of anti-English violence, culminating in the attempt by the revolutionary Wolfe Tone and his United Irishmen to encourage a French invasion of England. This was famously dispersed by a handful of Welsh fishwives at Fishguard, Pembrokeshire, in 1798. Men were selected by ballot to serve for longer periods, but volunteers who came forward to fill the militia quarters, as was the case with John Bateman. This civilian force, whose officers consisted of local gentlemen, drew their ranks from the poor and semi-literate, and the wives of those men already married were allowed to live within the walls of the garrison and follow their husbands wherever they might be stationed. Whether willingly or not, John took Mary with him, and in doing so exposed his wife to a whole new sphere of opportunity in which to expand her nefarious activities. While on march encamped in barracks or billeted in towns, naturally the militia were closely engaged with the civilian population, and needless to say, trading relationships offering the opportunity for black market transactions in regimental clothing and equipment were many. Mary would soon have had her fingers firmly stuck in one of the many illegal pies afforded her. Of course, her new situation would have been considerably widened. Mary's scope for the performance of her established arts of fortune, telling and divination, capitalising on the gullible and unsuspecting within the ranks, as well as people of the districts, wherever the regiment ended up. Married quarters for other ranks offered little privacy. Beds were arranged in dormitories, the family home being a bed on the other side of a horse blanket, slung over a rope across the room. No specific details of Mary's exploits during her husband's services have come down to us, but it is safe to assume that she got up to her old tricks and maybe even acquired some new ones. Eventually, and perhaps again of necessity, after 3 years, John quitted the service, and in 1799 the couple returned to Leeds, perhaps feeling that enough time had passed for the outrage and memory of Mary's prior misdemeanours and blackened reputation in the town to have sufficiently faded. Taking up residence in March Lane, near Timble Bridge, and a good half-mile from their previous home in Wells Yard, Mary set up selling trinkets and love charms and offering her healing services and predictions of the future to unsuspecting customers taken in by her guile. Regardless of Mary's proficiency, whether her clients were satisfied by a coincidental happy chance outcome, or conversely were too ashamed to admit, they'd resort to Mary's ministrations if the matter did not turn out well for them. At this time, Mary began to specialise as a professional agent for a screwer-down, an art which requires some explanation. Persuasive in convincing her victims that someone or other intended them harm, Mary nevertheless assured them that the potential evildoer could be prevented from acting if they were screwed down. While Mary did not profess to be able to perform this service herself, of course, she would defer Now, Mrs. Moore, though a very respectable and real name for Mary, was an entirely fictitious colleague who possessed supernatural skills As the seventh child of the seventh child. The number 7 had ancient magical properties, or so the superstitious believed. The seventh child of a seventh child was particularly blessed with second sight. Intriguingly, some believed that such an offspring was the agent of the devil himself. Mary would tell people she would seek Mrs. Moore's counsel for those knottier problems she felt herself unable to resolve. Mrs. Moore was apparently proficient as a screwer-down of husbands with wandering affections. She was as equally adept at screwing down creditors that pursued unpaid debts, with Mary acting as her agent, and of course taking payment on the lady's behalf. It was while acting as Mrs. Moore's representative that Mary also started a business as a part-time abortionist. While procuring or performing abortion was actually against the law prior to 1803, abortion, or the offence of attempting to induce a miscarriage, was punishable by a fine or short term of imprisonment. As the population of Leeds continued to swell, so did the birth rate. In such a climate of poverty and overcrowding, and in absence of any effective methods of birth control, Mary's services must have been in demand. For those in desperate and dire straits, the alternative was infanticide, a crime for which a woman could be found guilty under a statute passed in 1624, even if she simply tried to hide her pregnancy and later miscarried, or if the infant was a stillborn. Understandably, countless women sought to remedy their conditions, especially amongst the ranks of domestic servants who often stood to lose their positions if they were discovered to be with child. Single teenage girls, recent migrants to the city in fruitless search of work as domestic servants, accounted for about a third of those who turned to work in the streets of Leeds as prostitutes, and there were many like Mary herself on hand to offer their services, for monetary gain, of course. A knowledge of folk remedies, of harvesting and administering the centuries-old concoctions of pennyroyal and tansy, and the most effective combinations of these herbal abortive fashions, had most probably been garnered from the toply fair gypsies with whom Mary had a freely mingled childhood with. Pennyroyal, Mentha pulgium, also called puddling grass, smells of spearmint, and is highly toxic. In small doses it was used in cooking and the making of herbal tea. Tansy, Tanactum vulgare, that's the Old Latin. New Latin, Tanactum vulgare. Depends whether you're old or new. Also called bitter buttons, was used to aid conception as well as endure abortions. Nevertheless, there was a high risk of endangering the life of the mother, as attested to by the many murder cases in the late 18th and the early 19th centuries that were a consequence of poisonous draughts administered in an attempt to induce an abortion. We must not know how many of the women that Mary helps, or we do not know. It could have been thousands. We don't even know if any suffered fatal consequences, but she certainly supplies something stronger than a herbal remedy to at least one young woman, as detailed later. We'll talk about that later. She definitely did. With regard to the mysterious Mrs. Moore, a lady called Mrs. Greenwood was the first recorded victim of Mary's dupe, though many had probably preceded her, but we have no evidence. Mary had obviously identified Mrs. Greenwood as susceptible and manipulated the poor woman into believing that she had foreseen a terrible future for her. Mrs. Greenwood, she predicted, was in danger of attempting suicide in the view of the desperate domestic misfortunes about to befall her, namely that her husband, who was away from home at the time, had been locked up in jail and that only Mrs. Moore could secure his release. According to Mary, 4 guards had been set to watch over Mr. Greenwood in his imprisonment, and the necessary course of action would be to screw down any of the guards, to facilitate his escape. As there were 4 of them, in order for Mrs. Moore to get Greenwood out, Mrs. Greenwood would need to provide 4 pieces of leather, 4 pieces of blotting paper, 4 brass screws, and, tellingly, 4 pieces of gold to make an effective charm. The window of opportunity was narrow, however, and if these items were not placed in Mary's hands by nightfall, by the following morning Mrs. Greenwood would be a widow. While Mrs. Greenwood may well have been able to get the first 3 items on the list, she certainly didn't have 4 pieces of gold. Yet Mary had a ready suggestion to overcome the obstacle. Mrs. Greenwood could borrow or steal the necessary coin. Fortunately for Mrs. Greenwood, this last suggestion set alarm bells ringing, and the mention of theft brought her to her senses. Realising she had very nearly been taken in by Mary, she disassociated herself from the whole sorry affair, and was certainly the richer and hopefully the wiser for it. Sadly, in a testament to Mary's skill as a fraudster, many others were completely taken in. The next victims exposed to Mrs. Moore's scenario proved more pliant, and in the stead family Mary found ripe pickings in both husband and wife. Basil Stead, a failed businessman, easily persuaded that his creditors were fast closing in, with Mary succeeding in working his paranoia into a panic, rather than face the inevitable, reasoning to the bailiffs at his door. He decided to join the army, even handing over his enlistment fee to Mary. Recruits at the time received the king's shilling, the daily pay for an infantryman, but this was merely a token of signing on in a illiterate age, the bringer or recruiting sergeant, as well as telling tales of regimental glory, would give the recruit a bounty, that's additional expenses, which could add up to £9. That's a lot back then. More money than many men had seen before in their own lives, actually, back then. This was removed from them for incidentals when they reached the barracks, and was probably the fee that Stead gave to Mary. Simultaneously, Mary worked on his wife, telling her that her husband was keeping a mistress, and that he was on the point of eloping with her when he left to join his regiment. The mistress, Mary said, lived in Vicar Lane, about half a mile further into the heart of Leeds, and at the time an extra crowded slum and slaughterhouse were around. To add more fuel to the lie, the woman was also pregnant by Stead. The remedy for the situation would be for Mrs. Moore to screw down the love rival, but in order to do so, payment of £3 were necessary, over a week's wage for a skilled craftsman, and Mrs. Moore's screws would never dry without money. In addition to the cash fee, bizarrely 2 pieces of coal were also required. Of course, the money went straight into Mary's pocket, but the coal was to be placed on the mistress's doorstep, the idea being that, upon discovery to the pieces of coal, and then obviously she would see them, throw them in the fire, then there would be smoke that would put out the love rival, into a deep sleep apparently. It would taint her clothes, freshly laundered, in anticipation of the elopement. It would spoil the onset. Mary reasoned that the mistress would be prevented from leaving with the errant husband, as she would have no clean clothes to take with her. To all intents and purposes, from Mrs. Stead's point of view, the charm worked. Her husband left the next morning to join his regiment, without the mistress, who of course never actually ever existed. Conveniently, his departure left his grateful and impressionable wife to the mercies of Mary, who proceeded to fleece her to the extent she was forced to pawn virtually every article in the marital home, eventually reduced to complete penury. She attempted to suicide by drowning herself in the River Calder, but she was luckily saved. Mary's actions were rendered even more wicked in light of the fact that Mrs. Stead was expecting a child. At some point, the Leeds Benevolent Society intervened. This charity was also known as the Strangers' Friend Society, founded in 1789 by a group associated with the Wesleyan Methodist Church. It investigated all applications for relief, gave food and money, found others work and provided children with suitable education. Mrs. Stead clearly did now qualify for this assistance, and to ease the expectant mother's destitute situation, a guinea was offered in poor relief, paid in 3 separate payments of 7 shillings. Mary, however, managed to extort 18 shillings of the relief payment, to be used to screw down the benevolent society into granting further monies on the wretched woman's behalf. In a desperate and highly susceptible state, Mary also convinced Mrs. Stead that it was the intention of her father-in-law to murder her. Naturally, it was only Mrs. Moore who possessed the power to avert the crime, though a further guinea would be required in payment. Pawning what few possessions she had left to raise the sum, Mrs. Stead was nevertheless safe in the knowledge that Mrs. Moore's ministrations had paid off. After all, her father-in-law had made no attempt on her life. Well, he never was gonna, was he? Because it's fake. Even though Mrs. Stead had virtually nothing left, Mary continued to put pressure on the poor woman. She told her that the Stead's daughter, 8 at the time, would become pregnant at 14 and would either murder herself or be murdered by her seducer. The solution was for the child to wear a silver charm bracelet. That would keep her safe, but would cost 17 shillings to be paid to Mrs. Moore. Needless to say, Mary switched the silver, and the charm was later discovered to be made of pewter. This falsehood, along with many others perpetrated by Mary, were finally exposed when one of Mrs. Stead's neighbours managed to convince the distraught woman that she had been utterly taken in. By this time, the few tools left behind by her husband before he joined the army, and the only items now left in the house, were pawned in payment for screwing down all the officers in his regiment, with a view to securing his discharge. It was possible to buy one's way out of the army, but the cost was huge. Oddly enough, in this instance, Mrs. Moore's ministrations failed, perhaps as there was now nothing left to extort. Having wrung this victim dry, Mary turned her attention to the young relative of the Steads, who had come to Leeds when she found herself pregnant and deserted by the father. Mary assured the young woman that the purchase of a series of charms, priced at 1 guinea each, would bring the baby's errant father to her side. When the magic failed, Mary then promised to ensnare the eligible son of a reasonably affluent family from whom the girl had worked in service. With no proposal forthcoming, Mary recommended a stronger charm, at additional cost, of course. When this also failed, she offered, and presumably at additional cost again, to provide medicines that would induce an abortion. The concoctions did indeed work, but also wrecked the health of the young woman, who, in an advanced state of emaciation, exclaimed, "Had I ever known Mary Bateman, my child would now have been in my arms, and I should have been a healthy woman. But it is in eternity, and I am going after it as fast as time and ruined constitution can carry me." Whether the death of this unfortunate young woman and her unborn child was the first directly attribute to the ministrations of Mary to be an abortionist, we cannot know. The only redeeming feature of the whole Stead affair was that eventually Mary was exposed, though Mrs. Stead still fervently believed that the charms stitched into her clothing had the power to preserve her life. These were merely a number of long strips of paper tied to a knot enclosing a small scrap of rag and a small piece of gilt leather. When she was eventually persuaded to remove them, upon finding she was still well and breathing, the awful realization of Mary's exploitation of herself and her family led the wrong woman to threaten Mary with arrest and imprisonment for fraud unless she immediately redeemed all the pawned household items and made good on the money she had extorted. Realizing her game was up, Mary repaid the sum of 4 guineas, which was, well, we must assume, was not honestly come by. But as for returning Mrs. Stead's furniture and clothing, unsurprisingly, she, well, reneged on her word. Yet it is a testament to Mary's skill as a consummate deceiver that she continued to find a flourishing market for her criminal services, though it was possibly Mary's next mark, a family called Cooper, that funded the repayment of the 4 guineas, as she undoubtedly run her scams concurrently. Whether or not the Coopers were aware of Mary's infamy, Mrs. Cooper was nevertheless persuaded, through ignorance or blind faith, to believe that her husband was intent, and when she says intent, she means very intent on selling the contents of their home and deserting with the proceeds. To avoid this and being left destitute, Mrs. Cooper was advised by Mary to lodge the best of her furniture in Mary's house for safekeeping, including a fine grandfather clock, which very soon ended up in the pawnbroker's, along with the rest of the Coopers' belongings. At least the Coopers emerged from their dealings with Mary with their lives, which is more than can be said for the 3 unfortunate women, a mother and 2 daughters, who ended up buried in the same grave, a consequence of Mary's evil enterprise. This time, there was another alter ego. Enter Miss Blythe. And I'm going to leave it there now until we come back and do the next episode, which will be The Hand on Miss Blythe. Another interesting story on Mary's. She seemed very good though, didn't she, sometimes? But though, I don't know, guys. I mean, if that was me, I don't think I could have believed any of that, you know? Like, it doesn't even seem believable, to be fair. What she was saying to me, I couldn't have. But when she was talking to the women she was talking to, we have to remember at that time they were vulnerable and overworked, you know, they were tired, underpaid, and there was a lot going on. So I suppose it would be easier to believe back then. But, yeah, she, wow. You know, like, wow. I mean, can you imagine getting someone else to pawn all their items within their house, right? On behalf of paying this person because of all these magical doings. It's unbelievable. Thank you for listening. Come back for the next episode. Many blessings.